The wind howled like a ghostly lament through the twisted trees of the snow-covered forest. Heavy flakes fell mercilessly from the sky, creating a relentless white veil that reduced visibility to just a few meters. The cold cut like sharp knives, penetrating deep into the bones of Sullivan's Sully graves, a man in his mid-30s, lost and on the brink of exhaustion. His thick coat was no longer enough to protect him. The ice seeped into his skin, numbing his limbs. Every step through the thick snow was a struggle, a cruel reminder that his strength was fading. He had no idea how long he had been wandering. Time had lost meaning ever since he had been separated from his group during the storm. His feet caught on a hidden root beneath the thick snow, and he crashed heavily onto the frozen ground. The impact forced a ragged groan from his throat. The frigid air burned his lungs as he tried to push himself up, but a sharp pain shot through his right ankle. "Damn it!" he muttered through gritted teeth. He knew he had to keep moving, but every attempt sent fresh waves of agony through his leg. Leaning against the rough, ice-covered trunk of a massive tree, Sully panted, struggling to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from exertion, but from something deeper, something primal, a gut-wrenching instinct telling him he wasn't alone. Then he heard it. First, a muffled crunch in the snow, like something big moving nearby. Then, a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the oppressive silence of the forest. Sully froze. His wide eyes darted toward the darkness between the trees. The shadows shifted. No, they weren't just shadows, they were eyes. Yellow, glowing, locked onto him with a predatory intensity. His stomach twisted as the creatures stepped forward from the gloom. Gray wolves, four of them, larger than any he had ever seen. Their thick coats blending seamlessly into the snowy landscape, their muzzles dusted with frost. The animals moved with slow, deliberate steps, forming a half-circle around him. The fur along their spines bristled, and their tails hung low, a clear sign that they weren't just curious. They were hunting. Sully felt adrenaline flood his system, his trembling fingers desperately searching for anything around him that could be used as a weapon. But he was defenseless. His hatchet had been lost in the fall. His survival knife, buried somewhere beneath his layers of clothing, seemed useless against what was coming. His body tensed as one of the wolves, the largest of the pack, stepped forward, bearing its gleaming white fangs. Time seemed to slow. Sully knew running was impossible. If he tried, he wouldn't make it 10 feet before the wolves were on him. Scream? For who? He was alone, swallowed by the endless white of the frozen forest. His mind screamed for a solution, anything to get him out of this. But his body, betraying him, remained frozen, like a helpless deer cornered by its predator. This was it. A bitter acceptance seeped into his chest, a cold realization that this might be the last breath he took. His heart, once racing, now beat in a slow, heavy rhythm, resigned to the inevitable. But then, something happened. The pack leader stopped. Its snout lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as if catching an unexpected scent in the air. The others followed suit, exchanging brief glances. What were they sensing? What had made them hesitate? Sully realized, with a desperate mix of hope and fear, that this pause might be his only chance. But could he trust it? Or was it merely the prelude to something even worse? What will happen to Sully? Surrounded by wolves, with no way out, something made the pack hesitate. But was it a sign of hope or an even greater danger? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Turn on the notification bell and comment. What do you think will happen to Sully? Sully's breath came in short, ragged bursts, forming small clouds in the icy air. His muscles were coiled, every nerve screaming at him to act, to move, to do something. But he remained still, locked in a dangerous standoff with the pack of wolves. The leader, a massive gray beast with piercing amber eyes, hadn't attacked yet. That hesitation was the only thing keeping Sully alive. His mind raced. Why were they waiting? Wolves were efficient killers. If they had decided he was prey, they wouldn't hesitate. But something had shifted, something had disrupted their instincts. The alpha sniffed the air again, ears twitching. The other wolves followed suit, their eyes flickering between Sully and something unseen beyond the trees. Then he heard it. A distant sound, faint but distinct, cutting through the heavy silence of the forest. A deep, resonant howl. Not from the wolves in front of him, but from somewhere else. It was far away but strong, commanding. The wolves reacted immediately. Their ears flattened slightly, their bodies tensed. Another pack. Sully's breath hitched. Wolves were territorial. If another group was nearby, a fight could break out. Or worse, they might retreat and come back with more numbers. Sully knew he had seconds to act. His frozen fingers clumsily fumbled through his coat, desperate to grasp the handle of his knife. He didn't stand a chance in a fight, but he'd rather go down fighting than wait for them to tear him apart. The cold metal pressed against his palm as he pulled it free, his grip weak but determined. He had no plan, just desperation. His mind screamed that this was a terrible idea, but then the alpha moved. Its eyes locked onto his hand, ears twitching at the subtle sound of the blade being unsheathed. For a brief moment, neither moved. The entire world seemed to shrink to just them, locked in a deadly stare. Sully's fingers tightened around the handle, his breath shallow. This is it, he thought. The alpha took another step forward, slow, calculated. Sully braced himself, shifting slightly to push off the ground despite the searing pain in his ankle. But then, the wolf did something unexpected. It let out a short, low whine. Not a growl, not a snarl. A sound that almost resembled hesitation. The other wolves exchanged glances, their rigid postures softening ever so slightly. What was happening? Then, without warning, the alpha turned away. Just like that, it trotted a few steps, pausing only to glance back at Sully before continuing into the trees. One by one, the others followed, their massive bodies vanishing into the swirling snowfall. Within seconds, the forest was silent again, as if they had never been there. Sully's heart thundered in his chest, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He was alive, but why? Wolves didn't just abandon prey. Something had stopped them, something bigger than hunger or instinct. His hands trembled as he exhaled shakily, adrenaline still flooding his veins. He couldn't stay here. Whatever had sent those wolves away might still be out there, and he wasn't about to wait around to find out what it was. Gripping his knife tightly, Sully forced himself onto his injured leg, biting back a groan. He needed to move now, but as he limped forward, pushing through the snow, one lingering thought refused to leave his mind. Had he been spared, or was he being hunted by something far worse? Sully pushed forward, each step a battle against the biting cold and the stabbing pain in his ankle. His breath was ragged, his vision blurring at the edges from exhaustion. The wolves were gone, but a gnawing unease sat heavy in his chest. They didn't leave because of him. They left because of something else. He had seen the tension in their bodies, the way their ears twitched toward the distance. Something had unsettled them, something strong enough to make a pack of predators retreat without a fight. The snowfall thickened, obscuring his surroundings in a swirling white haze. His instincts screamed that he needed shelter before nightfall, but the landscape was a never-ending expanse of trees and snow. He had lost all sense of direction. North, south, it was all the same now. His only choice was to keep moving, despite his battered body. He wiped the ice from his eyelashes and squinted into the storm. That was when he saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They were partially covered by fresh snow, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone else had been here. Recently. Sully's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced through the possibilities. A rescue team? A lost hiker? Or something else entirely? The realization sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't alone out here. Adrenaline surged through his veins, momentarily numbing the pain in his ankle. He hobbled forward, following the tracks with newfound urgency. If there was someone out here, he had to find them. Maybe they knew the way back. Maybe they had shelter. Or maybe they were running from the same thing the wolves had sensed. The thought unsettled him, but he had no choice. He had to follow the trail. The prince led him deeper into the forest, winding between massive, ice-covered trees. The deeper he went, the more the air felt wrong. The stillness of the forest was unnatural. No wind, no rustling of branches. Even the usual distant sounds of birds or small animals were absent. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Sully gritted his teeth. Something was off. Then suddenly the footprints stopped. His heart pounded as he scanned the ground. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of someone turning back. The prince just ended, as if the person had vanished into thin air. Sully's throat tightened. This didn't make sense. He turned in slow circles, searching for any clue, any sign of where they had gone. His fingers tightened around the handle of his knife. The silence pressed in on him. Then, from the trees behind him, a sound. A low, deliberate crunch in the snow. Sully whipped around, his breath frozen in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. Sully's fingers tightened around the knife as he turned toward the sound. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. The crunch in the snow had been deliberate. Something or someone was there, watching. But the trees stood silent, their gnarled branches weighed down by thick layers of ice. The snowfall was lighter now, allowing more visibility, yet he saw nothing. His eyes flicked back to the footprints that had mysteriously ended, his stomach twisting. Whoever had left them had vanished without a trace. No sign of turning back, no drag marks, no struggle, just gone. Sully swallowed hard, trying to silence the rising panic clawing at his throat. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the fresh snow had simply covered the rest of the trail. Maybe exhaustion was messing with his head. Maybe another crunch. Closer this time. Sully whipped around, his body rigid. He could barely hear his own breathing over the deafening silence of the forest. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, but his injured ankle throbbed in protest. He wouldn't get far. His best option was to stand his ground, to face whatever was out there. But then he noticed something that sent a fresh wave of terror through his veins. The wolves were back. Not the same ones from before, these were different, bigger. Their fur was darker, their bodies leaner, built more for endurance than brute strength. They stood at a distance, partially obscured by the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Not moving, not attacking, just watching. Sully's grip on the knife tightened. What were they waiting for? Then he saw it. Behind the wolves, barely visible between the trees, a figure. Sully's breath hitched. Human, or at least it looked human. Tall, wrapped in heavy furs, blending into the frozen landscape. Their face was obscured by a hood, their posture unnervingly still. Sully's stomach churned. Was this the person who had left the footprints? The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, surrounded by the silent, watching wolves. A sharp gust of wind cut through the trees, rattling the frozen branches like brittle bones. Sully forced himself to speak, his voice raw from the cold. "Who are you?" No response, no movement. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then, just as Sully opened his mouth to speak again, the figure turned and walked away. Not toward him, but deeper into the forest. The wolves followed. Sully stood frozen, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. He had a choice: stay where he was and risk freezing to death, or follow the stranger into the unknown. His gut twisted. He already knew what he had to do. Gritting his teeth, he took a step forward. Sully's breath came in sharp bursts as he limped forward, each step sinking into the thick snow. His instincts screamed at him to stop. Turn back, get away, don't follow. But where else could he go? He was alone, injured, and lost in a frozen wilderness that offered no mercy. The stranger was his only lead. If they knew a way out, if they had shelter, he had no choice but to follow. The footprints were barely visible in the fresh snow, but Sully kept his eyes locked on them. The figure moved effortlessly through the trees, gliding like a shadow, while the wolves slinked alongside them, their bodies weaving between the trunks in near silence. They weren't attacking. They weren't hunting him. They were with the stranger. The thought sent an uneasy chill down Sully's spine. What kind of person walked with wolves like that? As he followed, the forest around him began to change. The trees grew denser, their twisted limbs closing in overhead, blocking out what little light remained. The silence was suffocating. Even the wind had died, leaving only the crunch of his own footsteps. Then suddenly the stranger stopped. Sully froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The wolves fanned out, their bodies tense. Something was wrong. Sully barely had time to react before a sound split the air. A deep, guttural snarl, unlike anything he had ever heard. It didn't come from the wolves, came from somewhere ahead. The stranger turned slightly, just enough for Sully to see part of their face beneath the hood's sharp, weathered features, eyes that burned like embers in the cold. Without a word, they raised a hand, signaling him to stay back. A heavy thump echoed from the darkness ahead. Then another. The ground beneath Sully vibrated slightly, as if something big was moving, something massive. He felt his stomach twist as the wolves lowered their heads, baring their teeth. Whatever was coming, even they were afraid. The stranger moved first. With a slow, deliberate motion, they reached into their cloak and pulled out something long and sharp. A blade, ancient-looking, its metal darkened by time. Sully's pulse quickened. Who was this person? And what the hell were they leading him into? He wanted to run, to turn back before it was too late, but his feet wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place, trapped between fear and a terrible, gnawing curiosity. Then, from the shadows ahead, something stepped into view, and Sully forgot how to breathe. Sully is frozen in fear, the wolves are on edge, and the stranger is armed. But what just stepped out of the shadows? Drop your theories in the comments. Is it a beast? A spirit? Something worse? Let me know what you think Sully is about to face. Sully's pulse pounded in his ears as the figure emerged from the shadows. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was too big, too unnatural. A hulking shape, its massive frame covered in thick, matted fur, its breath rising in steaming clouds against the icy air. The creature's eyes, yellow and intelligent, locked onto him with a predatory focus that sent a primal terror surging through his body. The wolves around the stranger growled low, their bodies tense, their ears flattened. Even they knew this thing was beyond them. Sully instinctively gripped his knife tighter, though he knew it was useless. A blade wouldn't stop something like this. The stranger, however, remained perfectly still, their grip firm on the ancient blade in their hand. Sully could see their breath, slow and controlled, as if they had faced this thing before. The beast took another step forward, the ground trembling beneath its weight. It let out a sound, a deep, guttural snarl, not just of aggression but recognition. Sully's breath hitched. Did it know the stranger? Or worse, did it know him? His mind reeled with the impossibility of it all. He had heard stories of things lurking in the deep wilderness, things that weren't supposed to exist, but he had never believed them, not until now. Then, in a blur of motion, the stranger moved. They lunged forward with inhuman speed, their blade cutting through the air. The beast roared, a deafening, earth-shaking sound that sent shivers down Sully's spine. The wolves attacked next, darting in and out, their teeth flashing like daggers in the dim light. Sully stumbled back, his injured ankle screaming in protest. He had no idea what to do. Fight, run, or stand there and pray this thing wouldn't rip him apart. The battle was brutal. The creature swung a massive arm, sending one of the wolves flying into the snow with a yelp. The stranger dodged effortlessly, moving like a ghost, striking at the beast's thick hide. Sully wanted to believe they could kill it, that this was just another predator to be taken down. But then the beast turned its gaze back to him, and in that moment Sully knew. It wasn't after the stranger. It was after him. His stomach dropped. Why? What had he done? What was this thing? But there was no time to think. The creature lunged toward him, its massive form blocking out everything else. Sully barely managed to throw himself to the side, hitting the frozen ground hard. Snow exploded around him as claws raked through the spot where he had been standing a second before. He had to move. Now, Sully hit the ground hard, his body half buried in the freezing snow. Pain shot up his injured ankle, but he had no time to dwell on it. The beast was coming for him. He scrambled to his feet just as a massive clawed hand slammed into the ground where he had been lying, sending a spray of ice and dirt into the air. The force of the impact shook the earth beneath him. If it had connected, he would be dead. The stranger shouted something, words lost in the chaos, but Sully wasn't listening. His body had already made the decision for him. He turned and ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he forced himself forward through the deep snow. Move, move, move. Behind him, he heard the beast's heavy steps pounding against the frozen earth. It was fast, too fast. The deep, guttural growl that followed made his stomach twist in terror. The wolves were still attacking, their snarls and barks filling the night, but Sully didn't dare look back. He wouldn't survive if he hesitated. Branches slapped against his face as he barreled through the dense forest, his mind screaming for a plan. Where could he go? There was no shelter, no escape, just endless snow and trees. His only chance was to keep moving, to outrun something that was stronger, faster, and built for this terrain. He wasn't going to make it. Then, through the blur of trees and swirling snow, he saw it. A ledge. A sheer drop, disappearing into the darkness below. His breath hitched. It was suicide, but staying was worse. He could hear the beast gaining on him, feel the tremors of its monstrous steps vibrating through the ground. No time. No choice. Sully gritted his teeth and pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the voice in his head telling him he wouldn't survive the fall. 5 steps. The ledge was right there. The wind howled around him, carrying the scent of pine and cold death. For steps. His legs screamed in protest, his body ready to collapse. 3 steps. The growl behind him turned into a roar. Closer. Closer. 2 steps. Jump. Sully threw himself off the edge. The world spun. The cold night swallowed him whole. And as he plunged into the abyss below, his last thought was simple and absolute. If the fall didn't kill him, the thing chasing him would. The wind ripped past Sully's face as he fell, his body twisting in the air. The cold bit into his skin like 1,000 needles, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt weightless. Adrift in the black void beneath the cliff. This is it, his mind whispered. This is how I die. Then, before he could brace himself, he hit. The impact was brutal. Sully crashed through a thick layer of snow, his body slamming into the hard, frozen earth beneath. Pain exploded in his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. His vision blurred. Everything around him was spinning, or was it just his head? He lay there, gasping, blinking up at the swirling snowfall above. Am I alive? His fingers twitched. His legs burned. His ankle throbbed worse than before. If I can feel pain, I'm not dead. Somewhere above, a monstrous roar shattered the night. Sully flinched, rolling onto his side, his breath coming in ragged gulps. The beast was still there, still hunting him. He forced himself up, pain screaming through every muscle. The fall might not have killed him, but it had left him weak and vulnerable. He needed to move. Now, he stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the deep snow. The landscape around him had changed. The trees here were denser, the air thicker, almost suffocating. There was something unnatural about the silence, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It felt like the forest itself was watching him. His fingers tightened around his knife. Where the hell am I? Then, a sound, soft, deliberate footsteps. Not from the beast above. From behind him, Sully spun, his pulse spiking. The stranger. They stood a few yards away, their dark silhouette barely visible against the snow-covered trees. The wolves were with them, their glowing eyes flickering in the dim light. But the stranger wasn't looking at Sully. They were looking past him. Sully followed their gaze, and his stomach dropped. There was something else here. In the trees, just beyond his line of sight, something moved. Slow, silent, watching, a shape too large, too unnatural to be human. Sully's body tensed. He wasn't out of danger. He had just fallen into something much worse. Sully's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he locked eyes with the stranger. They weren't afraid. That terrified him more than whatever was lurking in the trees. His body screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible, but his legs refused to move. The air around him felt wrong, thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing down on him. The wolves stood motionless, their ears flattened, their bodies low to the ground. They sensed it too. Then, a shape emerged from the darkness. It was tall, too tall. At first, Sully thought it was another tree, just a trick of the dim light. But then it moved. Slow, deliberate, its form shifting unnaturally. Its limbs were elongated, its body covered in a thick, black fur that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Its eyes, deep-set and hollow, gleamed with an unnatural hunger. Sully's stomach twisted violently. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't a man. It was something else entirely. The stranger stepped forward, their grip tightening around the ancient blade. Sully saw their face more clearly now. Weathered, scarred, unreadable. They knew this thing, had seen it before, maybe had even fought it. Without breaking eye contact with the creature, they gestured towards Sully with a single, commanding motion. Move. Sully hesitated. Move where? There was nowhere to go. The cliff behind him, the creature in front of him, the stranger and wolves at his side. He was trapped. His fingers trembled around the hilt of his knife, utterly useless against something this monstrous. He wasn't meant to survive this. The creature let out a sound, a deep, rattling exhale. Not quite a growl, not quite a whisper, but something in between. It took another step, the snow beneath it melting as if it were rotting the ground itself. Sully's breath hitched. His body told him to run. His mind told him it was pointless. But before he could make a choice, the stranger lunged. In an instant, the wolves sprang into action, snarling, snapping, moving with deadly precision. The stranger's blade gleamed as it struck the creature's flesh, sending out a burst of dark, steaming liquid. The thing screeched, a sound so unnatural it made Sully's vision blur. He stumbled backward, the raw force of the battle unfolding before him like something out of a nightmare. And then he realized, this wasn't a fight. It was a distraction. The creature wasn't after the wolves. It wasn't after the stranger. It was still looking at him. Sully felt his entire body tense as the creature lunged. Not at the wolves, not at the stranger, but at him. His instinct screamed, but there was no time to react, no time to run. This was it. The thing moved impossibly fast, a blur of darkness slicing through the snowfall. Sully barely had time to raise his knife, knowing it was useless against something this monstrous. But then, a flash of silver, a blur of motion. The stranger intercepted the attack. Their ancient blade sank deep into the creature's side, and the thing let out a blood-curdling shriek, its massive body recoiling. The impact sent Sully sprawling backward into the snow, his lungs burning from the cold and fear. He gasped, trying to make sense of what was happening. The battle was a whirlwind, wolves tearing into the creature's limbs, the stranger moving like a phantom, striking with precision. But it wasn't enough. The creature wasn't dying. It lashed out, throwing the stranger aside like a rag doll. They hit the ground hard, their blades skidding across the ice. The wolves yelped as they were knocked back, regrouping quickly but hesitant now. Sully's breath hitched. The stranger had fought like someone who had faced this thing before, and even they couldn't stop it. That left only him. His fingers tightened around his knife. Useless. His body trembled. No chance. The creature's hollow eyes bore into him, filled with something more than hunger, something personal. Why him? Why had it chased him through the forest? Why had it ignored the wolves, ignored the stranger, ignored everything else just to reach him? Then he understood. A memory surfaced, his grandfather's stories. Tales of ancient things that stalked the deep woods, hunting not for food, but for something else. something unfinished. Some debts, he had once said, were passed down through blood. Sully's chest tightened. This thing had been waiting for him, hunting him, maybe for years, maybe for generations. And now it had him, unless the stranger's blade lay just a few feet away, its dark metal glinting in the dim light. Sully's heart pounded. The knife in his hand wouldn't work. But that blade had wounded it. The creature moved, preparing for a final strike. Sully didn't think, he acted. With a raw, desperate cry, he lunged. His hands closed around the hilt of the blade just as the creature swiped at him. He twisted, driving the weapon up, deep into its throat. The impact reverberated through his arms as the creature let out an inhuman scream. Its body convulsed, dark liquid spilling across the snow, hissing like acid as it touched the ground. The wolves howled, their voices echoing into the night as the creature staggered backward, its form collapsing in on itself. Then silence. Sully fell to his knees, his breath ragged, his body trembling. It was over. The wolves slowly approached, circling the now motionless body. The stranger, battered but alive, pulled themselves up, their piercing eyes locking onto his. Approval, respect, a silent understanding. Sully didn't need to ask who they were or why they had helped him. He already knew. This was bigger than him, older than him, but tonight, against all odds, he had survived. For now, don't leave without smashing that like button. If the story gave you chills, imagine what's coming next. Hit like to support and subscribe so you don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Turn on notifications and be the first to uncover the next terrifying mystery. What would you have done in Sully's place? Let me know in the comments below. See you in the next one. If you survive.